Hello, everybody. My name is Shawn McCarthy, and introduced as journalist until very recently a reporter. And so I dealt pretty much in covering the news, and it's a pleasure to get to comment on the news. I was not a columnist or an editorialist, so in this guise, I get to play that role a little bit. In confronting the global challenge of climate change, I think there's two critical factors that we have to take into account: responsibility and leadership. And I want to suggest that Canada is uniquely placed to accept our responsibility and to help lead the world in practical solutions that will avert the worst impacts of the looming climate crisis. In 2015, I was covering the energy beat for the Globe and Mail, and I was assigned to cover the Paris Climate Summit that December. I was well aware of climate change and the impacts that we were all expecting from it, but nothing more prepared me for that event than some personal milestones. We had our first two grandkids born in February and August of that year, and I realized in a deep and visceral way that the year 2100 was within the predicted lifespan of those two babies and their generation. What kind of world would we leave them? Science tells us if we don't get this right, if we don't get climate change under control, it will be a grim dystopia. This morning we heard from the IPCC. By 2100, even under a 2-degree scenario, by 2100, 280 million people around the world will have their homes submerged. Think of the refugee crisis that we will face under that kind of scenario. There are solutions that will mitigate the impacts, but we need to act with urgency. With urgency, it's an emergency. And we have to do so in concert with international partners in order to tackle a global problem. I think Canada has a special responsibility to show ambitious leadership, both at home and internationally, but it has to be based on a pragmatic plan of action. Lofty rhetoric and targets won't do. We need concrete policies that Canadians can endorse, that get real GHG reductions, and that don't simply export emissions to other countries where we can then import the results of that industrial activity. At the Climate Change Conference in New York this week, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on all countries and businesses to ratchet up efforts in their climate action. With existing commitments, those on the table now, we're not on track to limit warming to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And it's only with ambitious domestic action that Canada can play a meaningful role in meeting those more ambitious targets. During the Conservative years, during the Harper years, Canada gained a reputation as a climate laggard. I covered a number of COPs, the climate summits that happen every year, and routinely Canada was awarded the Fossil Award for failure to not only show leadership, but to lead from behind, if you will. That did change in 2015. After winning the October election, Justin Trudeau arrived in Paris at the Paris Summit to restore the reputation, Canada's reputation. Flanked by premiers like Alberta's Rachel Notley and Ontario's Kathleen Wynne, Mr. Trudeau proclaimed that Canada is back to signal a new commitment to action. And I would argue that Canada's leadership at Paris mattered. We were an early supporter of the aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees that was included in the text that had not been planned. We pushed successfully for reference to Indigenous people in the text of the Paris Accord. Minister McKenna personally led negotiations to get Article 6, which allows for international trading of emission reduction credits and could facilitate, if it ever gets worked out, a more efficient global approach to reducing emissions. Covering the announcement of a deal on that final day of many long days at Paris was intense, but I allowed myself a brief moment of relief and hope, reflecting on the fact that for this one moment, governments of the world had reached agreement, imperfect though it was, on a common goal. Unfortunately, few, if any, countries have lived up to the promises of Paris. Over the next 4 years after that agreement, the Liberal government did begin to implement the accord. In 2016, the federal and provincial governments, minus Saskatchewan, endorsed carbon pricing and a host of other policies to reduce emissions. Since then, the Liberals have been steadily, albeit slowly, rolling out measures, and they include the carbon tax that is one of the flashpoints in the current election. But we still don't have all the policies in place to meet our 2030 target, let alone exceed it. That gap widened after conservative provincial governments eliminated existing emission reduction programs, especially in Ontario, and after the Trudeau government approved major oil and gas projects to access new markets for our resources. You often hear the line that Canada only accounts for 1.6% of the world's emissions, so Canadian action is futile. And it is true that aggressive Canadian climate policy in isolation would have virtually no impact on the trajectory of climate change. But we're not talking about action in isolation. We're talking about action that prepares the country for a future economy, that serves as a signal to the world of what is possible, and that allows Canada to play a leadership role in global councils. That role will be forfeit with a timid domestic response. While that 1.6% figure is accurate, it also doesn't adequately reflect our collective responsibility. Consider also, we're among the top 10 GHG emitters in the world. We're at the top of the charts in terms of emissions per person. We're among the world's leading exporters of oil and natural gas, and we are among the wealthiest countries on earth. So if Canada can't show leadership on climate change, who will? The fact that our total emissions are relatively small doesn't absolve us of responsibility. One voter doesn't make a difference in an election, but responsible citizens participate. One soldier doesn't turn the tide of a war, but they're expected to do their duty. In the absence of global government, the only system the world has is one of national commitments made under a treaty. Canada committed not only to meet its existing 2030 targets, which is to lower emissions by 30% from 2005 levels by 2030, but to exceed them, both before 2030 and after, and to aim for a 1.5 degree target. That commitment represents this country's appropriate share in addressing a global problem. So Canadians clearly need to take greater action. That includes every aspect of our society, federal and provincial governments, individual Canadians and corporations, energy producers, and energy consumers. We also have to be pragmatic about how we go about it. There are three realities that can't be ignored or painted over with hopeful words. The first is that within Canada, the price of transition will not fall equally. Alberta and Saskatchewan depend heavily on fossil fuels for wealth and jobs. It's not surprising they're among the most resistant to aggressive climate action. These regions need to be given time to make the transition, even as we avoid further investments in infrastructure that would lock in emissions growth in the oil and gas sector. Secondly, Canada is a federation in which provinces own the resources and have a large role in regulating energy production and use. The federal government cannot do this alone. And third, we need to think about carbon leakage, a phenomenon of shifting emissions from a highly regulated jurisdiction to a less regulated one. It doesn't serve any purpose to have emissions move from Ontario, say, because we're shutting down steel plants, only to import the steel from Ohio. It creates real challenges for Canada as governments look to force industry to cut their emissions, but well-designed regulations can drive down GHGs while not merely exporting the emissions. So in noting these practical limitations on government action, I'm not suggesting any sector get a pass from the responsibility to reduce emissions. The oil and gas industry has to dramatically reduce their emissions intensity, and they are making big investments to try and do that, even as we put a lid on the overall emissions from the industry. But we have to impose costs fairly across the country. We have to look to the demand side of the equation, where the cost burdens on vulnerable Canadians can be more easily offset through rebates and other government transfers, the energy efficiency policies and programs that Brendan talked about. Buildings and transportation together account for more than a third of Canada's emissions. Let's accelerate action there. Consumer packaging and household waste are major sources of GHGs. Let's focus on reducing those. Agriculture, forestry, and yes, nature can contribute solutions. Let's demand more from them and ratchet up support for their low-carbon practices. I would argue that we need to take our responsibility to heart. In the past, we've had great debates in this country about deficits and the folly of imposing financial burdens on our children. In the name of intergenerational equity, we have to assume the costs now of climate mitigation for the future. Our children, and yes, our grandchildren, deserve no less. Thank you.